They left me on the pier in Red Hook, with my hands zip-tied behind my back, and told me I'd never see another sunrise as a Castellano. They didn't know I already owned everything they were standing on. My name is Simone Adeas Carter, and before I tell you how I took back an empire that was never really theirs to give away, I need you to understand that I loved that family. Not the money. Not the marble floors or the black cars, or the way men twice my age used to stand up a little straighter when I walked into a room because they knew I could read a balance sheet faster than they could read a menu. I loved the people. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this story, but it's the truest part, so I'm starting there. I was 29 years old the night everything changed, and I still have the scar over my left eyebrow from a car accident when I was 7, a thin silver line that never quite tans the way the rest of my skin does in the summer. I used to joke that it was my one permanent reminder that I'd survived something before, so I could survive anything. I didn't know how true that joke would turn out to be. I wore my late mother's gold cross around my neck every single day of my adult life, and on my right hand, on the smallest finger, I wore a heavy antique gold ring with a crest on it that had been given to me when I turned 16 by a man everyone called Don Vincent, and almost nobody knew was actually my father. I was the chief financial controller for Castellano Holdings, which on paper was a mid-size real estate and import company headquartered in a glass tower in Lower Manhattan, and underneath the paper was the beating financial heart of one of the last real crime families still operating on the East Coast. I didn't grow up wanting this life. I grew up in Bed-Stuy with my mother, who cleaned houses on the Upper East Side for 20 years, one of which belonged to a quiet, careful, immaculately dressed older man named Vincent Castellano. I didn't find out he was my father until I was 14, after my mother got sick, and he sat across from me at our kitchen table with his hat in his hands like a man asking permission to exist in my life, and told me the truth because he said a Carter woman deserved better than a lie on her deathbed. My mother lived 4 more years after that. Vincent paid for every doctor, every hospital room, every single thing, and never once asked for anything back, and never once told another living soul in his organization that I was his blood. He put me through Fordham, then through my CPA license, then quietly, patiently, over almost a decade, into the financial architecture of his empire, first as a junior analyst nobody looked twice at, then as the woman who understood every shell company, every offshore account, every piece of real estate that had a Castellano fingerprint on it, better than anyone alive, including Vincent himself by the end. He used to sit in my office on Friday evenings with 2 glasses of scotch, one he drank and one he poured for me, and never touched himself because he liked watching me leave it untouched too. And he'd say, "Simone, the numbers don't lie, they don't have loyalty, they don't have blood, they only have truth, and if you understand the numbers, you understand the family better than anyone with the last name Castellano ever will." I didn't know yet how literally he meant that. I remember my first week in the Fordham accounting program, 18 years old, sitting in the back of a lecture hall in a coat that didn't fit right because it was the warmest thing my mother's church had been able to find for me on short notice, and thinking that a girl from Bed-Stuy with a dead mother's dream sewn into her had no business believing she'd ever run anything bigger than her own checking account. Vincent used to call me on Sunday nights during those years, always at exactly 8 o'clock, always the same question. What did you learn this week that scared you? Not what did you learn that scared you? Because he said the things that frighten you when you first understand them are the only things worth actually learning. I didn't understand until much later that he was training me the way his own grandfather had trained him, one careful, frightening lesson at a time. Except his grandfather had trained him to hold a gun steady, and Vincent was training me to hold an entire empire steady without anyone ever seeing my hands shake. By the time I was 25, I had rebuilt the entire internal ledger system for 6 different holding companies myself, working nights and weekends while the rest of the analysts on my floor went home at 6, because I understood something the other analysts didn't, which was that the man signing my checks had buried my mother, paid for the only college I would have never otherwise afforded, and looked at me every single day like I was worth investing in rather than worth using up. That kind of loyalty isn't something you fake for a paycheck. It's something that gets built into your bones, and I want you to remember how deep that loyalty ran in me, because it's the exact thing Tony was counting on when he decided I would be easier to remove than to compete with. His nephew Anthony Castellano, who everyone called Tony, was the son Vincent never had and the man Vincent trusted least, though he never said that second part out loud until the very end. Tony was 38, sharp-jawed, always in a charcoal suit that fit a half-size too tight in the shoulders because he liked people to notice the gym time, and he had a way of looking at me across a boardroom table like I was a very expensive piece of office furniture Vincent had installed for efficiency. Tony called me the accountant for 6 years, never Simone. The accountant, like the word itself, was doing me a favor. I let it slide because Vincent told me to let it slide, because Vincent had a plan, and I trusted that plan with my whole life, right up until the night I found out I might have trusted it a little too much, a little too blindly, and that's the first thing I want you to remember, because it matters later. I still have the ring he gave me at 16. I want you to hold on to that detail. I didn't know yet what it actually was. Vincent Castellano died on a Tuesday in October, quietly, in his sleep, in the house on Long Island where I'd spent every Sunday of my adult life pretending, for 6 hours a week, that I had a normal family. Tony became acting head of the organization by Thursday. I stood in the back of St. Anthony's at the funeral in a black dress my mother would have hated because it was too plain, and Tony stood at the front giving the eulogy, calling Vincent his father in every sense that mattered, and I let that lie sit in my chest like a swallowed stone because it wasn't the time, and because 3 days before he died, Vincent had called me into his study and handed me a sealed envelope with strict instructions. "Simone," he said, "you don't open this until the anniversary of my death, not before. Promise me." I promised him. I didn't know what was in it. I still didn't know, months later, the night everything fell apart, and I'm telling you now so you feel it the way I felt it, which was blind, which was trusting, which was a woman walking forward in the dark because a man she loved told her the floor would hold. For the first 4 months after Vincent died, Tony and I had what I would almost call a partnership. He needed me, and he knew it, because I was the only person on earth who understood how the money actually moved, which accounts fed which shell, which properties were clean, and which were 3 layers deep in something that could put every man in that family behind bars for the rest of his natural life. There was a night in December, cold enough that the windows of the Tallow Room, the private club on the Upper East Side where the family did its real business, had frosted at the corners, when Tony poured me a drink himself and said, "Simone, I know my uncle trusted you more than he trusted me, and I'm not too proud to say I need that same trust now. I believed him. I want you to understand I really believed him, because I wanted to. Because grief makes you want to believe the people standing next to you in the wreckage are on your side." For a few weeks after that night at the Tallow Room, I let myself believe we could actually build something together. Tony started copying me on meetings Vincent had never let him near while the old man was alive, negotiations with a construction outfit in Jersey, a sit-down with a capo named Sal Bonavita, who ran the family's interests in the garment district, and who had known me since I was 23 years old and used to slide me an extra plate of his wife's brachol whenever I worked late in his office. Sal used to call me kid, the way you'd call someone family, not the way Tony called me the accountant, and for a little while, with Sal in the room and Tony copying me on things he'd once kept locked away, I actually believed the organization might survive Vincent's death with its soul mostly intact. I even started drafting a 5-year plan to move another 20% of the family's revenue into fully legitimate channels, the kind of plan Vincent and I used to sketch out together on his study floor with a bottle of wine between us, and Tony sat across from me in that glass conference room and nodded along like a man who actually wanted the future I was describing. That was the small win, the moment of trust. I want you to remember exactly how it felt, warm and fragile, like a hand extended across a table, because 6 weeks later that same hand closed into a fist. It started with a shortfall, $340,000, missing from an account that fed one of the family's cleanest fronts, a chain of parking structures in Queens that Vincent had used for years to launder cash from 3 other operations. I found the shortfall myself, on a Tuesday night, alone in my office at 11 p.m., because I always ran the reconciliations myself, no assistants, no exceptions, that had been Vincent's rule, and it had become mine. I traced it for 6 straight hours. By 4 in the morning I had a spreadsheet that showed, beyond any argument, that the money had been moved by someone with my own login credentials, at a time when I was 200 miles away at my cousin's wedding in Baltimore, with 40 witnesses and a hotel keycard log to prove it. Someone had used my access. Someone inside the family had framed me, cleanly, deliberately, with real financial sophistication, which meant it wasn't some soldier trying to skim off the top. It was someone who understood the system as well as I did. I brought it to Tony myself, first thing, because I still believed in the small win, in the hand across the table. I laid the whole thing out for him in the glass conference room, with the city spread out gray and cold behind us, and I watched his face, and for 1 second, one single second, I saw something flicker across it that wasn't surprise. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. I'm going to tell you what it meant when we get there. 2 days later, 4 men I had known for years, men whose kids I had bought birthday presents for, walked into my office without knocking and told me Tony wanted to see me at the warehouse in Red Hook. Not the boardroom, the warehouse. I knew before we even got in the car that something had shifted underneath me, the way you know a floor is about to give before your foot actually breaks through it. I didn't know it yet, but that ride to Red Hook was the last time I would ever be treated as family by people who had known me for 11 years, and I still don't fully know which one of them made the call that turned them against me that fast. I'll tell you what I've pieced together. I'll tell you what I still don't know for certain. That's an honest confession, and I owe you an honest one, because everything after that pier was built on things I learned too late to stop from happening the way they happened. I called Sal before I called anyone else, because 11 years of extra Brayshole plates had to count for something, and I remember standing in the stairwell of the tower with my phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, listening to him tell me, voice low, almost kind, that he believed me, that he'd known me too long not to, and that he'd talked to Tony himself before this went any further. That was the brief recovery inside the bigger fall, a small pocket of air before the water closed back over my head, because 2 hours later Sal called me back, and his voice had changed entirely, gone flat, and careful in a way I recognized immediately, because I'd spent 11 years learning to read the smallest shifts in men like him. He told me Tony had already made up his mind, that there were things happening above both our pay grades now, and that the kindest thing he could do for me was tell me to disappear quietly, before somebody decided quiet wasn't an option anymore. I understood, standing in that stairwell, that Sal wasn't betraying me out of malice. He was protecting his own daughters, his own plate of Brayshole, his own fragile place in a world that had just proven to him exactly how fast the ground could open under anyone, including me. I didn't hate him for it, I still don't, but it was the moment I understood that trust inside that family had never been about love. It had only ever been about who was standing closest to power when the lights went out. The warehouse smelled like diesel and cold concrete, and the particular kind of silence that 4 armed men make when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end before it starts. Tony was standing under a bare hanging bulb, and for the first time in 11 years, he didn't call me the accountant. He called me a thief. He said Vincent's death had exposed things, weaknesses, people who thought grief made them invisible, and he said it looking directly at me, and I understood in that moment that the $340,000 was never about $340,000. It was about power. It was about a man who had spent his whole life standing in his uncle's shadow, and who had discovered, the moment that shadow disappeared, that there was another shadow standing exactly where he wanted to be, and that shadow was mine. I told him the truth. I told him I was in Baltimore. I told him to pull the hotel records, the wedding photos, the toll records from my cousin's car. He said records could be built by someone smart enough, and the terrible elegant cruelty of it was that he was describing me, using my own competence as the evidence against me. Because who else in that organization was smart enough to fake a paper trail that clean, except the woman who built every real one? I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment he closed a loop I'd have to spend the next year prying back open. They took my phone. They took the badge that opened the tower elevators. One of the men, a soldier named Ray who used to bring his daughter by the office at Christmas so I could help her with her math homework, wouldn't look at me while he zip-tied my wrists, and I remember thinking, in a strange calm corner of my mind, even as my heart was slamming against my ribs, that his silence hurt worse than Tony's accusation, because Tony was a man protecting a throne, and Ray was just a man protecting himself, and I understood both of those instincts, even while they were breaking something in me that I don't think ever fully grew back the same shape. They drove me to the pier. It was February, the water black and moving under a sky with no stars in it, just the orange smear of the city behind us. Tony told me, standing 3 feet away with his hands in his coat pockets like he was discussing weather, that I was done, that I would disappear from every account, every property, every piece of paper that had ever had my name near it, that if I went to the police I would find out exactly how thin the line was between the front and the family, and that if I ever tried to come back, the next conversation wouldn't happen on a pier with my hands tied. It would happen somewhere nobody would ever find me. Then he told his men to leave me there, in the cold, hands bound, coat gone. Told them cars from the family didn't owe me a ride anywhere ever again. That was the moment. Left for dead in every way that mattered, if not literally. And I want to be honest with you. Standing there in the dark with the East River sliding past 6 feet from my shoes, some small ugly part of me wondered if literally was still on the table. I didn't know it yet, but the man who cut my zip ties an hour later, a dock worker named Delroy, who found me half frozen and said nothing, just cut the plastic and put his own coat over my shoulders and walked me to an all-night diner and bought me coffee without asking a single question, would turn out to matter more to what came next than almost anyone else in this story. I'll come back to him. I spent that night in a motel off the Belt Parkway with no phone, no badge, $300 in cash from an ATM before they could have frozen anything, and 11 years of my life sitting in my chest like broken glass. I cried for exactly 1 hour on the bathroom floor with the shower running so no one in the next room would hear me, and then I stopped, and something in me went very cold and very still and very clear, the way water goes right before it turns to ice, and I thought about the envelope, Vincent's envelope, sealed, sitting in the bottom of a safety deposit box under my mother's maiden name, which I'd used because Vincent told me to. Told me a smart woman keeps one door nobody else knows exists. He'd said, don't open it until the anniversary. That was 8 months away. I had promised him, and I sat on that cold motel floor and made the first real decision of the rest of my life, which was that I would honor the promise, because breaking it felt like the last thread connecting me to a man who had never once, in 14 years, lied to me about anything that mattered, and I needed, in that moment, to believe that thread still held. I didn't know yet whether it would hold, or whether I was about to spend 8 months being loyal to a dead man's instructions while his family destroyed what was left of my name. That uncertainty sat in my stomach like a stone for the entire 8 months that followed, and I'm not going to pretend to you now, with all of it behind me, that I always felt strong. Some nights I didn't feel strong at all. I moved to a small apartment in Newark under my mother's name, took work under the table doing books for 2 Nigerian restaurant owners in the Ironbound who paid cash and never asked why a CPA with obvious skill was scared of paperwork with her real name on it. I watched, from a distance, through court filings and industry gossip, and one careful lunch with Delroy the dock worker, who it turned out had worked the Castellano docks for 15 years and had his own reasons for disliking Tony, exactly what was happening inside the empire I had built the spine of. It wasn't pretty. Tony was spending faster than the legitimate fronts could clean it. He was making enemies of 2 other families over territory Vincent had always handled with patience instead of pride, and a federal task force out of the Eastern District, the same one that had quietly investigated Castellano Holdings for 3 years without ever finding a thread to pull, had apparently found one in the sloppy, arrogant financial moves a man makes when he's running a machine he never actually learned how to build. The 2 Nigerian restaurant owners who hired me, a husband and wife named Chidi and Ngozi Okafor, never once asked why a woman with a CPA's precision was doing their books for cash in a back office that smelled like fried plantain and cardamom. Ngozi caught me crying once, over an invoice that had nothing to do with why I was actually crying, and instead of asking questions she just set a bowl of jollof rice in front of me and said, "Whatever it is, it will not always be this heavy," and went back to the register like she hadn't just handed me the only kindness I'd been offered in weeks. I think about that bowl of rice more than I think about almost anything from that year. I had built an empire's worth of financial architecture, and I had never once, in 11 years inside that world, been handed something with no strings on it until a woman who barely knew my real name gave me dinner because I looked like I needed it. I kept a single burner phone during those months, and once a week, always from a different corner of Newark, I called Delroy, because he had become, without either of us really deciding it, the one thread still connecting me to the world I'd been thrown out of. He'd tell me what he was hearing on the docks, which was more than you'd think, because dock workers hear everything and are asked about nothing. And it was Delroy who first told me Tony had started skimming from the Queen's parking structures himself to cover a bad real estate bet in Miami, the same bet that would eventually put half of Castellano Holdings' clean money in the crosshairs of the Eastern District Task Force. It was Delroy who told me a second family, the Marchettis out of Staten Island, had started making moves on Castellano territory in Red Hook, because word had spread that the new boss couldn't hold what the old boss built, and it was Delroy, in a diner booth in March with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never drank from, who looked at me and said, "Kid, whatever you're waiting on, I hope it's worth the wait, because this thing is coming apart at the seams without you in the room." That was the brief recovery, if you can call watching your enemies struggle a recovery. It felt like something. It felt like maybe the universe still kept a ledger, even when the courts didn't. There was a night in April when I came back to my apartment in Newark and found the lock on my door scratched in a way that told me someone had picked it, not broken it. Someone patient, someone who knew what they were doing. Nothing was taken, nothing was obviously moved, but my mother's old photo album, the one thing in that apartment that actually mattered to me, had been pulled off the shelf and set on the kitchen table, open to a page with a photograph of me at 16, standing next to Vincent at a Long Island barbecue, both of us laughing at something out of frame. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message, and I understood it perfectly. Someone knew who I really was, someone had known for a while, and whoever it was wanted me to know that they knew, without ever having to say a single word out loud. I didn't sleep in that apartment again. I moved twice more before the year was out, always under a different variation of my mother's name, always with a bag already packed by the door. And I want you to understand that fear like that doesn't fade with time. It just becomes a second heartbeat you learn to live alongside. Then came the bigger loss, and I want you to sit with this one, because it's the part of the story I still have trouble telling without my voice changing. 5 months into my exile, I read in a small item in the Post, 3 paragraphs, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, that Ray, the soldier who had zip-tied my wrists and wouldn't meet my eyes, had been found dead in his car in a parking structure in Queens, ruled a suicide, no note. I didn't believe it was a suicide for one single second, and I still don't. I believe Ray knew something about who really moved that $340,000, and I believe he became a liability the moment Tony realized it, and I believe I will carry a piece of guilt about Ray for the rest of my life, because whatever he did to me on that pier, he had a daughter who needed help with her math homework, and I think about her more than I think about almost anyone else in this whole story. That was rock bottom. Not the pier, not the cold. Ray's name in 3 paragraphs in a newspaper I read standing in a bodega in Newark, with my hands shaking so badly I had to set the paper down on the counter. I want to tell you about the breadcrumbs now, the things I noticed at the time and didn't understand, because they matter more than anything else in this story, and I owe it to you, and honestly I owe it to myself, to lay them out the way I eventually understood them, not the way I understood them in the moment, because in the moment I understood almost nothing. The first breadcrumb was a locked page in Vincent's private ledger, a physical leather book he kept in his study, that I had seen 100 times and never had the code for. Vincent used to say, "Everything has a key, Simone. The trick of life is figuring out which lock you're actually standing in front of." I thought he was talking about business. He wasn't. The second breadcrumb was a meeting. 6 weeks before Vincent died, I walked into his study to drop off quarterly statements and found him with a man I didn't recognize, silver-haired, in an old-fashioned 3-piece suit, introduced to me only as Mr. Alvarez, a name that meant nothing to me at the time. Vincent's face did something I'd never seen it do before when I walked in unannounced, something close to alarm, quickly smoothed over, and he told me it was nothing, an old friend, and I believed him because I had no reason not to. I didn't know yet that Alvarez wasn't an old friend. He was a trust attorney, and he had just finished helping Vincent restructure the legal ownership of literally everything. The third breadcrumb was the ring, 16 years old, sitting across from Vincent at his kitchen table on Long Island, him sliding a heavy gold ring across the wood and telling me, "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him, and someday you'll understand exactly what it means, but for now just wear it and don't lose it." I wore it every day for 13 years and thought it was sentiment. It was never sentiment, it was a signet, and there is a very old, very specific clause in how the Castellano family's legitimate holding trust was originally structured back in the 1950s, one that almost nobody alive still remembered existed, that required the family crest, physically, on a specific ring, to authenticate certain transfers of ultimate ownership. I want to say that again slowly because it took me 8 months to understand it myself. The company wasn't just going to me on paper. The paper needed the ring to actually mean anything, and the ring had been on my finger the entire time. The anniversary of Vincent's death arrived on a Tuesday, exactly like the day he died, which felt like the kind of detail he would have appreciated. A man who loved patterns almost as much as he loved numbers. I drove out to the bank in Garden City where the safety deposit box sat under my mother's maiden name, and I sat alone in a small windowless room with fluorescent lights and opened the envelope Vincent Castellano had handed me 3 days before he died, and I finally understood every single thing I hadn't understood for the last year of my life. My hands were shaking before I even broke the seal. I remember sitting there for almost 10 minutes just holding it, running my thumb along the edge of the envelope, the way I used to run my thumb along the edge of Vincent's leather ledger, and some small superstitious part of me believed that once I opened it, whatever version of him still existed in my memory, unfinished, waiting, would finally close for good. I opened it anyway, because a promise to a dead man is still a promise, and because I had spent a year learning exactly how much it costs to keep faith with someone who can no longer explain themselves. He had known. That's the first thing the letter told me. He had known, for at least 2 years before he died, that Tony was not built to hold what Vincent had built, that Tony's hunger for the appearance of power would eventually override his discipline, and that when it did, the person standing closest to the real machinery of the empire, the person Tony would least be able to control and most need to eliminate, was me. He wrote that he was sorry for the years of secrecy, that he had wanted to tell the family the truth about who I was while he was alive, and that his own cowardice, his own fear of the very violence his own life had been built on, had kept him silent, and that this was the only apology he knew how to give me, which was to make sure that when they finally came for me, and he wrote when, not if, I would already own the ground they were standing on before they ever knew to look for it. 2 years before he died, working with Alvarez, Vincent had restructured Castellano Holdings' true ownership into an irrevocable trust, naming me as sole beneficiary and controlling owner, with all outstanding shares held by Tony and the other family capos revealed, in the actual trust documents, to be non-voting, ceremonial, essentially decorative, a system designed specifically so the men who thought they ran the empire could keep running its day-to-day violence and business, while never actually holding the deed to a single piece of it. The ring on my finger was the physical authentication key required, under the original 1950s trust charter that Vincent's own grandfather had written, to unlock and activate the full transfer, something Alvarez had rebuilt into modern legal language, but never removed, because Vincent told him some things should stay hard to fake. I sat in that windowless room and read that letter twice, and then a third time, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it wasn't triumph, not at first. It was grief, sharper than the day of the funeral, because the man had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly building me a fortress out of guilt, out of love he didn't know how to say out loud any other way, and he had died before he ever got to tell me himself, in his own voice, and I would have given every single dollar of that empire to have had 5 more minutes with him instead. Then he said 4 words, near the very end of the letter, that I still hear in his voice sometimes when I close my eyes. The room went silent, the way a room does when you're alone in it, and the truth finally lands all the way to the bottom. The 4 words were, "You were always mine," not the company, me. He was talking about me, and I finally understood that everything else, the money, the properties, the ring, had only ever been his clumsy, careful, terrified way of saying what he never got to say sitting across from me at a kitchen table one more time. I called Alvarez that same afternoon. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting a year for that exact call, and he told me something I hadn't known, which is that he had been quietly monitoring the organization's legal filings the entire time I was gone, watching for the moment Tony's mismanagement would create an opening, because Vincent had told him, if it takes her a year to come back, let it take a year. She'll know when the ground is ready. Alvarez met me 2 days later in his office on Park Avenue, a room lined with law books that looked like they hadn't been opened since the Nixon administration, and he walked me through the trust documents page by page, his finger tapping each clause like he was diffusing something delicate. He told me Vincent had structured the ownership so carefully that even a forensic audit by Tony's own lawyers would find nothing irregular, because there was nothing irregular. It had simply never occurred to anyone to ask whether the ceremonial shares Tony and the other capos held actually meant what everyone assumed they meant. Alvarez had spent the last year, exactly as Vincent instructed, quietly building a parallel file, documenting every improper transfer, every unauthorized loan against company assets, every dollar Tony moved without realizing he legally needed a signature from a woman he'd left tied up on a pier in February. Alvarez looked at me over his glasses and said, "Miss Carter, your father didn't just leave you an inheritance, he left you a legal weapon, and the only question left is whether you're ready to use it the way he built it to be used." The ground was ready. Tony's arrogance had left a trail 3 years of federal investigation hadn't been able to find on its own, but that I, with full legal ownership of every entity in question and Alvarez's help subpoenaing the exact records I needed, could hand to the Eastern District Task Force wrapped in a bow, framed not as a mob informant turning on her family, which would have gotten me killed twice over, but as the legitimate owner of a company conducting an internal audit and discovering criminal misuse of assets by an employee who had exceeded his authority. Tony had never had the authority. He'd just never known it. We spent 3 weeks preparing before we moved. 3 weeks I spent back in the city under armed private security Alvarez insisted on, reviewing 7 years of financial records with a small task force of forensic auditors sworn to confidentiality, building a case so airtight that even Tony's own attorneys, once they finally saw it, would tell him privately that there was no version of this fight he could win in a courtroom. I slept maybe 4 hours a night during those 3 weeks. I kept a photograph of Vincent on the nightstand of the safe house Alvarez arranged for me, the same photograph I'd mentioned to you earlier without telling you what was in it, taken at my Fordham graduation, him standing a careful, deliberate 3 feet away from me in the crowd of parents because he couldn't stand close enough to be seen as anything more than an old family friend. His hand raised in a small private wave meant only for me. I told you I still had that photograph, and I told you I'd tell you what was in it eventually. That's what was in it. A father, keeping his distance in public his entire life, so his daughter could have a future he was terrified his world would take from her. I looked at that photograph every single night of those 3 weeks, and it was the only fuel I needed. The next 6 weeks moved faster than the 8 months before them combined. I walked back into the glass tower in Lower Manhattan on a Thursday morning in October, 1 year almost to the day since I'd stood in the back of St. Anthony's, watching Tony give a eulogy for a man whose real family he didn't even know existed, and I walked in with Alvarez on one side and 2 federal marshals on the other, holding a folder with my name on the ownership documents and the ring, Vincent's ring, my grandfather's ring, catching the light on my hand exactly the way it had 100 times before, except this time everyone in that boardroom finally understood what it meant. I had until noon that day to have every asset frozen and every relevant account documented before Tony, who had been tipped off by a nervous accountant an hour earlier, could move a single dollar out of the country, and I remember standing in the elevator watching the floor numbers climb with Alvarez beside me, checking his watch every 30 seconds, feeling my own heartbeat count down the same clock. Because if we were even an hour late, 2 years of Vincent's planning and a full year of my own patience would have meant nothing. We weren't late. Tony was in the boardroom when I walked in, mid-sentence in a call I later learned was to a private banker in the Caymans, and I watched every single thing I'd carried inside me for a year. The cold pier, Ray's name in 3 paragraphs, the zip ties, the men who wouldn't meet my eyes, land on his face at once when he realized what the folder in my hands actually was. He said my name for the first time in a year, not the accountant, my actual name. And for one strange suspended second neither of us said anything else at all, the whole room holding its breath around 2 people who used to sit across the same conference table, pretending to build a future together. Then he laughed, short and disbelieving, and said this was insane, that I had no right, that Vincent would never, and I set the folder down on the table between us and opened it to the trust's authentication clause myself, and I watched his eyes drop to my hand, to the ring catching the fluorescent light exactly where it always had, and I watched the exact moment the laugh died in his throat, because some part of him, some old family instinct buried under all that borrowed confidence, recognized what that ring meant even before his lawyers could explain the legal language to him. I told him, quietly, that I had given him a year to prove he could hold what his uncle built, and that he'd spent it proving the opposite, and that the men in the hallway behind me weren't there to negotiate. I watched him understand, in real time, exactly the way I'd understood on the floor of that windowless bank room, that he had spent the last 12 months building a throne on top of ground that had never belonged to him for a single day of his life. The federal marshals moved on him 20 minutes later. Wire fraud, racketeering, obstruction, a list Alvarez's team had assembled with a precision that made even me a little afraid of what I'd help unleash. I watched him led out through the same glass lobby where he used to call me the accountant, like the word itself was an insult, past Sal Bonavita, who stood frozen by the elevator bank with his hat in his hands, unable to meet my eyes the same way Ray had once been unable to meet mine, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which wasn't joy. It was closure, quiet and heavy, the kind that doesn't come with fireworks, just with the sudden absence of a weight you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. It's been a little over a year since that morning, and I want to tell you honestly what my life looks like now, because I promised you I'd close every loop I opened and I meant it. Tony took a plea, 14 years, a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and I have not visited him, not out of cruelty, but because there is nothing left to say between us that a courtroom transcript hasn't already said better. Ray's daughter, whose math homework I used to help with at our old Christmas parties, is 19 now, and I quietly cover her tuition at Rutgers under an anonymous scholarship fund Alvarez's office administers, because some debts aren't legal ones, they're just debts, and I intend to keep paying that one for as long as I'm able. Delroy, the dock worker who cut my zip ties on the worst night of my life and asked for nothing in return, now runs logistics for the legitimate shipping and real estate arm of what used to be Castellano Holdings and is now, on every piece of paper, simply Carter Holdings, because I changed the name the same week I changed everything else about how that company operates. The empire looks different now. I moved the business almost entirely into legitimate real estate development, community investment funds in the same Brooklyn neighborhoods where my mother used to clean other people's houses, and a scholarship program in Vincent's name, which I know is complicated. I know exactly how complicated it is to honor a man by giving away money he built through decades of violence, but I decided a long time ago, on that motel bathroom floor, that I would rather spend the rest of my life turning something poisoned into something useful than pretend I could walk away from it clean. In the first year alone, Carter Holdings funded the renovation of 3 community centers in Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, put 22 families through a first-time homeowner assistance program my mother would have qualified for herself 30 years ago if anyone had built it back then, and moved 81% of total company revenue into fully legitimate, fully taxed operations, a number Alvarez's compliance team checks quarterly and hands to me personally because I still don't fully trust myself to believe it unless I see it in writing. Sal Bonavita retired quietly to Staten Island with a pension I made sure was generous, because 11 years of brassiole and one unbearable phone call don't cancel each other out. They just sit next to each other, the way most complicated things in this life do. The Marchetti family, who had circled Red Hook the moment they smelled weakness, found a very different negotiating partner waiting for them once I took control. One with the actual legal standing, the actual capital, and the actual federal relationships to make expansion costly instead of easy, and the territory dispute that could have turned into a war quietly resolved itself into a business arrangement neither side particularly loves, but both sides can live with, which Vincent always used to tell me was the only kind of peace that actually lasts. I still wear the ring. I still wear my mother's cross. Some mornings I still put my hand up to the scar over my left eyebrow without thinking about it, an old habit, and I think about a man with his hat in his hands at a kitchen table in Bed-Stuy, telling a 14-year-old girl the truth because he thought she deserved better than a lie. If there's a moral in any of this, and I've had a year to sit with it, I think it's this. The people who underestimate you are usually the ones standing closest to what you already own, and they just haven't been told yet. Blood, real blood, isn't about who gets to say your name loudest in a room. It's about who tells you the truth, even when it costs them everything to do it. I want to ask you something, because I think about it more than almost anything else in this whole story. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found out you were worth more than everyone around you had let you believe? And if there was, what did you do the second you found out? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you even half as much as living it moved me, stay close, because there are more stories like mine, more people who were counted out right before the moment they were finally counted in, and I promise you, the next one is coming.